Wystąpienia naszych dwóch kolejnych panelistów będą w jakimś sensie kontynuować wprowadzenie do naszej dyskusji. Ich ujęcia będą również miały bardziej generalny charakter wprowadzający. Najpierw pan profesor Pasture powie nam bardzo, że tak powiem, przedstawi swoją jakby wizję z tego, jak katolicy i chrześcijańska demokracja, jaki sposób jakby ich sposób myślenia jakby uległ u podstaw projektu europejskiego i do niego też pierwszy głos tutaj będzie należał. Ja tylko muszę przypomnieć, że każdy z naszych panelistów w tym panelu ma 20 minut. I just reminded 20 minutes, okay? And then there will be a time for a discussion. So, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the kind invitation and for the very interesting program. I'm going to follow the example that Wolfram didn't follow, starting with kind of apologies. First is that I changed the title and the subject of my presentation. And secondly, I have the very bad habit to speak too long. So yes, don't hesitate 5 minutes or 7 minutes in advance to show.
Well, I will do my best to interrupt you in the right moment.
Please do, please do. Okay. I think there is little doubt about the decisive impact of Christian democracy and of Catholicism in general on the formation of the European communities, the EU, and indeed on Europe as a cultural and political space. And people like Wolfram Kaiser, and also from a very different perspective, Philippe Chenot, have established these links long ago, and we substantiated it very clearly. I will nevertheless revisit the long-term history of Christian democracy and Catholicism and their relation with Europe and with European unity in the framework of a book that I will publish very soon on imaging for European unity, and that gave me perhaps a few new insights and new perspectives. The first element that I want to stress is that the historiography of Christian democracy and of European integration, they both share an emphasis on the Second World War as a decisive break in history. And to some extent that's logical, and to some extent that makes sense. For the overall general framework, it is quite clear that Europe was divided, that on the one hand you have a kind of Eurasian Soviet empire that was created. I don't have to emphasize that here. And on the other hand you have a Western part where the different nations regained their sovereignty within a different kind of context, with a different kind of association with the United States in what some also call some kind of empire. But the emphasis on this break in Europe, the break also in history, has a number of fundamental problems. And one of those problems is that, for example, Central and Eastern Europe completely disappears from our perception of Europe, also from our imagination of European Christian democracy. Not only from what happened after the Second World War, but strangely enough, also on our perception of what happened before that period. So that's something that I came to realize how much that is the case when I was writing my book, and I must honestly say, I really understand how much that is the case only after completing the book, but nevertheless. Another major problem is that one has the tendency to overly focus on discontinuities. And that is very pity in many respects, mainly because the history of the relationship between Catholicism, Christian democracy, and European integration is far more complex, far more contradictory also than usually is imagined. And so I would like to revisit these continuities and discontinuities from this perspective. And I make a very large jump back, emphasizing that imagining a kind of integrated Europe, a Christian Europe, is a very old thing. And I will only refer to things after the French Revolution, but nevertheless, I refer to these famous words of the German poet Novalis, who around 1900 referred to, and I quote, "those beautiful, magnificent times when Europe was a Christian land, where one Christianity dwelled on this civilized continent, and when one common interest joined the most distant provinces of this vast spiritual empire. Without great worldly possessions, one sovereign governed and unified the great political forces," unquote. A kind of idea of a kind of Christian Europe, the restoration of a Christian Europe, loomed large all over the 19th and the 20th century. And that's something that is easily forgotten. That doesn't mean that Christians, Catholics or Protestants, constituted separate groups to argue for a particular European organization, at least not yet. Although at the end of the so-called culture wars that Professor Kaiser also has admirably studied, there were some initiatives. I refer to the so-called Black International that was created in the 1870s and 80s that to some extent argued for a certain European Union. The Austrian diplomat Gustav von Bloom, Emil Lamberts, has analyzed this very well, discussed a Europe which was different from the view from socialists, from liberals, and he pleaded for some kind of return of Christendom as a necessary condition for European rebirth. That idea of a European rebirth will return very strongly after or during the First World War, when widespread pessimism about the decline of European civilization ran high, especially, but certainly not only, among Christians. Again, I give one quotation, and a very interesting one in many respects, by the Catholic Belgian medievalist Godefroy Court, the author of a celebrated history of the origins of modern European civilization, les origines de la civilisation moderne. And I quote, "In order to avoid, if not annihilation of Europe, then at least its humiliation, Europe should close ranks and organize itself as the United States of Europe. Hence we will have number, and we would be able to maintain the prestige of Europe and of Christianity in front of the yellow races." Now, this is a surprising quotation, date from 1915 or 1916, but illustrates one major motivation to unite Europe, and that is not only with view of peace and pacification, but is very strongly to rebuild Europe against the competition, on the one hand, of the United States, a little bit also of Japan, but also very much the fear of decolonization and the rise of Asia. That was very clearly there. Similar ideas were, for example, expressed by Rudolf Pannwitz, the author of the Crisis der Europäischen Kultur, also in 1917. Pannwitz liked to call for Europe to spiritually revive, implying a spiritual base that would unite the Christian heritage with the great Asian spiritual traditions of the Buddha, Lao Tse, and Confucius. He imagined a kind of imperium europeum and pleaded for new Christian and European patriotism to replace nationalism. Most Catholic thinkers did not share his broad spiritual inspiration, but otherwise very similar ideas were presented by the German Abendland movement and by the Prince Karel Anton Rohan, the founder of one of the main cultural circles in interwar Europe, the Europese Kulturbund, which was also established in Vienna as well as in Paris as the Fédération des Unions Intellectuelles, and published the famous revue Européenne. What is important here is two things. Rohan himself pleaded for some kind of rebirth of Christian Europe, as a Europe led by the nobility, referring to medieval or early modern images of Christendom. But at the same time, people from the wide political spectrum contributed to his cultural initiatives. Apart from these circles, of course, Catholics were strongly engaged in initiatives for German, particularly German and French reconciliation. Many Catholics, for example, followed and contributed to the revue L'Europe Nouvelle, created by Louise Weiss, a French woman from Jewish descent. Particularly in Rhineland, progressives, but also conservative Catholics, business leaders, as well as left Catholics, argued for the reconciliation with France and defending a kind of European Union. The Catholic newspaper, the Kölnische Volkszeitung, in 1924, for example, pleaded for a united Europe, mainly seen in economic terms. The movement that I have studied very much, the International Christian Trade Union movement, for example, shared similar views in the all 1920s and 30s, as well as the initiative by the Catholic pacifist Marc Sagnier, the Internationale Démocratique. Also, the Holy See, in the early 1930s, discreetly supported the Plan Briand for a united Europe. Christians were also involved with the Pan-Europa movement, the most important interwar European federalist movement. The idea that you find sometimes in the literature, that the idea of European unity is actually an anti-Catholic initiative, is obviously wrong. It's interesting, and I address to the possible students, to investigate a little bit more why that is, because you do find within the contemporary sources elements that refer to this. But clearly at an international level, this was not the case. At an international level, Catholics collaborated to neutral and interfaith initiatives. Nevertheless, some Christians, Christian Democrats, started to unite also at international level among Christians. Famous is the Siblik, the International Secretary of Democratic Parties of Christian Inspiration, but we all know how marginal that actually was. And it was very divided on the issue of Europe. It's only in 1932 that some modest breakthrough was achieved when the last Siblik Congress, under the leadership of the then mayor of Cologne, Konrad Adenauer, a motion was voted in favor of a European Union, or a European common market, envisaging even a kind of political union in the long run. This was not the start of a new wave of Europeanism within Catholic or Christian democratic circles. However, two things happened. On the one hand, many more conservative Catholics, people around the Abendland movement, certainly Prince Rohan himself, completely drifted into fascist circles. Rohan himself, by the way, already in the early 20s, defined himself as a fascist. So I think that is an important element. And a second is that at the end, rather the end of the 1930s, then you do see a number of people who try to experiment with ideas of personalism, humanism, anarchism sometimes, and federalism. People like Alexandre Marc, who will play a major role in the European movement after the war, after World War. How much time I still have?
Okay, so around 5 minutes.
Oh, 5 minutes, okay. After the war, I want to point out two things before I jump to my conclusions. As I think most of you know, but still I think it's needed to emphasize, the idea of a strong European Union certainly did not impose itself immediately after the war. European federalists were actually marginalized, and there were very few after the war, in contrast to what many people think. The main leaders in Europe and across the Atlantic actually were very much on the way of repeating the errors of Versailles with a vengeance. Main guiding principles were, among others, the splitting and virtual destruction of Germany. In that perspective, some forms of regional European unity of collaboration were envisaged, but rather very marginally. It is mainly the Cold War that changed the perspective. In this transition, Christian Democrats played a role. But for me, it's still not really clear which role. Yes, you find a number of Christian Democrats with the European movement. People like Alexandre Marc. But the European movement at the beginning was rather marginal. The political leaders, that's a different story. And if we move from a transitional phase, where the initiative was with the Americans, we move to the phase beyond the formation of the Council of Europe, which certainly from a federalist perspective was a big disappointment. If we move to the Schuman Plan, yes, there we see an essential, very important contribution of Christian Democrats. But the main thing, of course, here is that at that moment, the Christian Democrats were in charge. So they had to grasp the opportunities. In grasping these opportunities, you do see a lot of ambiguity. Even with people as Schuman, Monet, who was not really a Christian Democrat, even if he was a Catholic. Also some people like Bidot. As even at the very moment that, especially in the early 1950s, there was continuous discussion also within the French government what to prioritize, a European organization or a transatlantic one. In the French case, with the view of American support for their colonial policies. So it remains very unclear how important, for me, how important the Christian democratic role actually was, and how much there were still reservations, and how much was political pragmatism, because that's also an important element. I make some concluding remarks. The first, notwithstanding a still dominant secular representation of European integration history and some contemporary presentations of European integration as a secular project, Catholics and Christians occupied a central stage in the debate on European Union all the 19th and 20th century long. Second, the recognition and desire to collaborate of Christian Democrats and Catholics to a European integration project after the Second World War is obvious, but remains not that clear. And there are two elements that I stress. On the one hand, their influence before the war was undoubtedly far greater than often imagined. After the war, it's more mixed. And why is that? I think it is their impact on the post-war integration is clearly overstated. But what makes the difference? A major difference after the Second World War is that in contrast with what happened after the First, is that there was no kind of what I challenging would call a palingenetic rebirth. No plea for a complete rebuilding, reimagination of Europe as Christendom. Sure, there was an idea of crisis. There was even an idea of a religious crisis. But there was not the idea of a rebirth. There was an idea, perhaps, of a very pragmatic new start. What are the important elements here? The first is that those ideas pleading for a kind of rebirth, a kind of palingenetic rebirth, to use that word, these ideas had been discredited. Most of the people arguing for this kind of rebirth of Europe ended up in fascism, or even in support of Nazism, but not so much. Some people who went on that road made their distance explicitly. I think, for example, of the Catholic Italian, the president of the Volta conferences, Francesco Orestano, who was very much ingrained in the Italian fascist system, but in 1942 denounced the horrors of Nazism. In some sort, some kind of redemption has happened. A second element here is that if there was a sense of religious crisis, this implied a new kind of mission, but the new ideas of mission that were developed after the Second World War, particularly in France, but also in Germany, they required the acceptance of the secular state. They did not immediately imply striving towards creating a new form of Christendom. They pleaded rather for collaboration with people of other faith in different kind of associations, and Christian democracy in many ways is the expression of this new kind of thinking, of this new kind of imagining a different relation between the religious and the secular. As I said, I'm not so sure if in the end the impact of Christian democracy and post-war European integration was as big as sometimes imagined. It was real, no doubt, but still. There's also the question of, very prominent also in contemporary historiography, what is the originality of Christian democracy here? And it is very difficult to really identify these original ideas, in part because they are so much intertwined with the ideas of other movements. And this kind of research is still in its infancy, as Professor Kaiser just mentioned. It is just this kind of interaction of different ideas that is so hard to pinpoint and to understand what is original and what is less original. Kees van Kersbergen, quite a number of years already, has contributed in his own very original way to answering it. He argued that the distinctive feature of Christian democracy would be its ability to compromise and to transcend political cleavages. And if you go to look at the impact, the role of Christian democracy in the creation of, for example, the European coal and steel community, as well as later institutions, that would offer a very clear example of this ability to negotiate, to transcend cleavages. But I think that looking too much to what is the originality of Christian democracy obscures the main thing. It is that an ideology, a politics, gets its meaning, its significance only in practice, through the daily interactions, in the formations of these institutions, for example.
Okay, but...
And that was the last word.
Yes. Okay, so thank you very much. That was quite long closing remarks, but okay. So we'll still have time for discussion. And the next speaker is Professor Antonio Varsori from the University in Padova. Professor, the floor is yours. And 20 minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Remind you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and my apologies to the translators, because I think it was possible to stick to the paper, but I think to have to cut, so to jump a lot, Well, first of all, also thank you to the organizer of the conference for inviting me. Well, if we examine the most widespread general text of history of the European integration, we will usually discover that few Italian politicians are remembered. Obviously, there are a few exceptions, Alcide de Gasperi and Altiero Spinelli. The former an established partner with Robert Schuman and Konrad Adenauer in the European pantheon of the founding fathers, the latter the standard bearer of the federalist ideal, mainly a European statesman rather than an Italian politician. But de Gasperi died in 1954, that is more than 60 years ago. So in spite of Italy's continuing involvement in the European construction, it seems that Italian politicians do not deserve more than a few vague remarks as actors in the European integration. This is more surprising when we think about the Italian Christian democracy. The Democrazia Cristiana ruled the country without interruption for about 50 years, till the collapse of the First Republic. With only two exceptions, the Spadolini and the Craxi cabinets during the 1980s, all the Italian prime minister had been leading members of the Christian democracy. And once again, with very few exceptions, a Christian Democrat almost always held the office of foreign minister. Last but not least, the loyal commitment towards the European ideal, together with the loyalty towards the Atlantic Alliance and the United States, as well as the interest towards the Mediterranean area, were the pillars at the same time of the Christian Democrats and of Italy's foreign policy. In my contribution, I will try to demonstrate that de Gasperi was not an isolated case when we deal with the Christian democracy attitude towards the issue of the European integration. On the contrary, the deep involvement in the integration process was a fundamental character of most Christian Democrat leaders. Last but not least, I will try to demonstrate that the Christian Democrats' European heritage influenced Italy's attitude towards the European Union well beyond the end of the so-called First Republic. The first Italian Christian Democrat leader of whom we may focus our attention is Amintore Fanfani. Fanfani belonged to the Christian Democrat ruling generation, which took the place of the Gasperi during the mid-1950s. He was born in 1908 from a peasant family in the Arezzo province. A brilliant student and a fervent Catholic in the mid-1930s, he became a professor of political economy at the Milan Catholic University. A supporter of corporatist concept, he began to oppose the fascist regime only during the war and took refuge in Switzerland. After the end of the conflict, he became member of the left-wing group of the Christian democracy, the so-called professorini, small professors, you know, with Dossetti and Lapira. A strong-willed, outspoken and ruthless politician, but also an intellectual, Fanfani began to emerge as a leading member of the Christian democracy in the mid-1950s. He favored the so-called turn to the left, that is the dialogue between the DC and the Nanny Socialist Party, as a way to create a center-left government bound to a reformist program. He was prime minister in various Italian cabinets during the late 1950s and early 1960s. Later on various different occasions, he was the head of the Italian Foreign Ministry during the second half of the 1960s. His political star began to fade during the 1970s. It is often stated that Fanfani was mainly interested in Italy's Mediterranean role and in the early aspects of the detente between Moscow and Washington. Actually, Fanfani, as Prime Minister or Foreign Minister, was compelled to face de Gaulle France challenging European policy. In this context, he was very active and, in spite of contrasting opinion, he won de Gaulle's respect. On the occasion of the negotiation of the Fouché Plan, Fanfani played an important role of mediator. Although Italy disagreed with de Gaulle's hegemonic ambition and his strictly intergovernmental approach, Fanfani thought that there was something positive in the French project, and that a compromise solution in the long run will favor the integration process. His position was different from the one nurtured by the Benelux countries. In this connection, it would be possible to point out the various bilateral meetings Fanfani had with de Gaulle. Some commentators argued that Fanfani admired de Gaulle and would aspire to create a presidential republic, a sort of forbidden issue in the Italian First Republic political milieu. Fanfani's cautious attitude towards de Gaulle's France was confirmed later on when he had to deal with Britain's first application to the EEC. The Italian government, which was led by Fanfani between late 1960 and mid-1963, was strongly in favor of Britain's involvement in the European community. From an international viewpoint, Italy had hoped that Britain could become a counterweight to France's hegemonic ambitions. Moreover, as the Kennedy administration supported Britain's application, Italy aimed at demonstrating its loyalty to the US. I will skip other aspects of Fanfani's European policy, but I will at least remember its full commitment and its strong interest in the mid-1960s on the issue of the CAP. It was mainly Fanfani's attitude in the summer 1965, which led to the empty chair crisis, you know. And later on, Fanfani followed very carefully, you know, what happened with the empty chair crisis. Unluckily for Fanfani, he was unable to see the final conclusion of the crisis because he was compelled to resign in November 1965 for domestic reason. And the empty chair crisis will offer the opportunity to deal with another Christian Democrat leader whose Europeanist record is of some relevance, Emilio Colombo. Colombo was born in 1920 at Potenza in Lucania, a bachelor and a devout Catholic. All his life was shaped by his political commitment in the Christian democracy. A member of the moderate wing of the DC, Colombo would be on various occasions between the 1960s and the 1980s prime minister, foreign minister, and head of important economic ministries. His European commitment began in 1961, when at the time, as a young Minister for Industry and Trade, he was the head of the delegation for the negotiation related to Britain's application to the common market. And, well, I would say that his good manners, almost curial, his tendency to favor compromise solution, his good sense, attitude, won the respect of the European partners, and also the British, always were skeptical towards Italian politicians, appreciated Colombo's effort and openly stated that the few progresses in the negotiation had been the outcome of Emilio Colombo's art of mediation. Colombo was called by Aldo Moro, president of the council, to deal with the final stage of the empty chair crisis. And we must remember something which is not usually well known, that in late 1965, Colombo had a meeting with the French foreign minister Maurice Couve de Mourville, and it was Colombo who put forward the formula of the agreement on disagreement. And I will state that Italian Christian Democrats were regarded as masters in creating Byzantine political formula which could reconcile what appeared to be impossible to reconcile. In Italy, the Moro convergent parallels are well known as a kind of Byzantine formula, you know, which try to reconcile everything, you know. So we may say that to a certain extent Colombo was one of the other of the Luxembourg Compromise, formula. If we come to Aldo Moro, which was one of the leading Italian statesmen between the 1960s and the 1970s, usually stated that Moro was not very much interested in foreign policy, which is not true. You know, Moro was a foreign minister for several times during the 1970s. And also in this case, it is usually stated that Moro was more interested in the Mediterranean area, in the Middle East, in the Third World issues. Also in this case, we will discover that on the contrary, Moro was one of the actors which took part in the relaunching of Europe, which took place after 1969, after the ENG European Summit Conference. It was, for example, at the origin of a policy towards the European younger generation, which is less well known, you know. It was very much concerned about the attitude of younger generation after 1968. And in the early 1970s, in the European context, he thought that, for example, Europe could be an ideal to be offered to the younger generation, you know, in order to cope with their frustration, their critical attitude towards the Western society. And we must not forget that Moro was also very much interested in the early 1970s in the relaunching of an effective European social policy. In this connection, if we think about social policy, we must not forget the example of Carlo Donat-Cattin. Donat-Cattin was a labor minister, a left-wing member of the Christian democracy, very near to the Italian Catholic trade union. And it was, for example, the one who started in the early 1970s the first example of a European social dialogue. And he supported the idea of a tripartite conference with the participation of the Entrepreneur Association, the European Commission, and the representative of the European Trade Union. And if we come to the last, last but not least, I will point out the role played by Giulio Andreotti. Giulio Andreotti, especially at the beginning in the 1970s, did not appear so committed towards the European ideal. In 1972-73, when for the first time he was prime minister, it was the period in which Italy decided to leave the European snake. And it was a period of crisis in the relationship between the European community and Italy. But later on, if we think about his experience as a prime minister in 1978, a government of national unity, created just after the kidnapping of Aldo Moro, we will discover that Andreotti was able to put at risk his government in order to accept the idea that Italy had to join immediately the European monetary system, And he tried to explain why he thought it was important, for Italy to join the European monetary system in 1978. And in this case, it's interesting to notice that he came back to the Gasperi tradition. And he stated and argued that the Democrazia Cristiana was the party of the European integration and of the European choice by all the Italian governments. Andreotti played a leading role also during the 1980s. We must not forget the role he had in 1985 at the European Milan Council, when it was Andreotti and Craxi who put forward the proposal for a majority vote, which led later on to the Luxembourg Intergovernmental Conference, in spite of Margaret Thatcher's strong opposition. And later on, Andreotti was Prime Minister when Italy took part to the negotiation for the European Monetary Union and the European Union during the early 1990s. We must not forget that Andreotti was at the origins of the most important Italian decision which involved the concept of external bound, an important concept which characterized all the European policy pursued by Italy, I would say since the late 1970s till now. And I will come to the last part and also to the conclusion. When foreign commentators think about Italian politics after the collapse of the First Republic, their attention usually focuses on Berlusconi and the poor relations between Italy and the European Union, as well as the European Union negative opinion of Italy when Forza Italia was in power. But they seem to forget that at first Berlusconi was in power for less than 1 year, and that between 1994 and 1996, the Italian governments were led by Europeanist technocrats, fully supported by the center left. And that between 1996 and 2001, as well as between 2006 and 2008, and also after 2011, Italy was ruled mainly by center-left coalition, usually led by Catholics or by technocrats, whose main goal appeared to be the loyalty to the European ideal. Moreover, we may argue that the European ideal, transformed into a sort of divinity whose opinions could not be challenged, was the only common aspect, the main ideological pillar on which politicians who had been part of the First Republic political system, that is, former communists, former left-wing Christian Democrats, former members of lay parties such as the Republican Party and so on, could build a political formula in a period in which most ideologies were going to disappear. In this context, the European legacy of the Christian democracy played an important role in shaping Italy's policy towards the European Union. The main representative of such a trend were Romano Prodi and, I would say the last, Enrico Letta. Romano Prodi was born near Bologna in 1959. He started a university career and then became a professor of political economy at the University of Bologna, where he was a member also of a well-known reformist think tank and publishing house, Il Mulino. He joined the Christian democracy and in 1978 he was appointed for the first time minister. During the 1980s, he was the president of the powerful IRI, or IRI, which controlled most of the state-owned industrial and banking system. So it is not surprising that in the mid-1990s, when Prodi proposed himself as the leader of a center-led coalition, the so-called Olive Tree, the main common pattern of such a coalition was the full adhesion to the European idea. Furthermore, when the Olive Tree won the general election in 1996, the foremost goal of the Prodi government was the recovery of the Italian economy through a policy of austerity that will enable Italy to be a member of the first group of European member states which would adopt the new common European currency, the euro. Such a policy appeared to be successful, and it is not by haphazard that later on Prodi was rewarded with the appointment as president of the European Commission. When in 2006 the center-left won the general election once again, Prodi came back to power as the true representative of the traditional Italian commitment to the European Union, and the European Union favored this development. And the last few words. When in 2013 the new election gave rise to a difficult domestic balance among the political parties, after a failed attempt at forming a government by Bersani, a former communist, once again the center-left chose a young heir of the Christian democratic tradition to lead the Italian government, Enrico Letta. Letta was born in Pisa in 1966. He studies political sciences at the Pisa University, where he got a PhD. Moreover, he specialized at Sciences Po in Paris, and he was almost immediately, as a young scholar, interested in the European Union. Perhaps we forget that he published a small volume with Il Mulino, obviously, which dealt with the enlargement of the European Union. He was the president of the Young European Christian Democrats, and he was a member of the Christian democracy when the Christian democracy was collapsing. His Europeanist record is outstanding, and like Mario Monti, he was very much appreciated in Brussels' small world as a full member of the Europeanist elite. But his government has been short-lived, as in, last year, Letta was compelled to resign and to leave the leadership to another leading representative of the Democratic Party, Matteo Renzi. At first glance, there seems to be a link, as far as the European commitment is concerned, between Renzi and other Christian Democrats. Actually, this is not true. Although Renzi is a Catholic, he belongs to a younger generation, and he has never been a member of the Christian democracy. Moreover, he has no Europeanist experience and no tie whatsoever with the tradition represented by the Christian Democrats of the First Republic, of the left-wing Catholics, members of the Olive Tree. His attitude towards Europe appears to be pragmatic, if not simplistic. He knows that the feelings of most Italians are no longer so in favor as they were only 10 years ago towards the European Union. While on the contrary, Euroscepticism is increasing also among the voters of the Democratic Party. So on several occasions he tried to exploit Eurosceptical slogans as a way to demonstrate that his government is bound to pursue a more realistic policy towards Brussels, such as Europe cannot be the Europe of the European bureaucrats, Europe cannot be the Europe of the bankers, and so on. When Federica Mogherini was appointed European Union representative for external affairs, Renzi argued that such a choice had been a personal and national diplomatic victory. He rejected, at least in his official statements, the policy of austerity advocated by Germany, but I would say that is by far more cautious when he is in Brussels. And so I can conclude that Matteo Renzi is a definite break with the Christian Democrats' Italian tradition, but also with the Italian Christian Democrats' European commitment. And I would say that an era in Italy's European policy with Matteo Renzi is definitely over. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Varsori.
Stanisław Gebhardt. Chciałem zapytać pana profesora odnośnie prac Fanfaniego. Nie wiem, czy pan profesor zwrócił uwagę, w 1957 roku w Arezzo Fanfani zorganizował spotkanie liderów europejskich chrześcijańskich demokratów, między innymi liderów chrześcijańskich demokratów na uchodźstwie, gdzie Karol Popiel ze Stronnictwa Pracy Polak wygłosił analizę sytuacji po wystąpieniu Chruszczowa słynnym, a później po zmianach w Europie Centralnej, w Polsce w 1956 roku historii węgierskiej i tak dalej. I tutaj był początek zainteresowania Fanfaniego sprawami, czy oficjalnie, że tak powiem, zainteresowanie Fanfaniego sprawami Europy Wschodniej. I wielokrotnie Fanfani się powoływał na te spotkania, które poszły po Arezzo i później, już w przełomowym okresie, w 1989 roku, jako dożywotni senator, prawda, już nie miał aktywnej roli w rządzie, bardzo pomagał odrodzeniu się chrześcijańskiej demokracji, niestety, jak wiemy, nie z wielkim skutkiem, co było oczywiście nie jego winą, ale sytuacji. I druga rzecz, panu profesorowi chciałem podziękować, bo ja jestem zwolennikiem i to wszędzie głoszę i robię, że Italia i to, co się stało po wojnie we Włoszech, powinno być przykładem dla nas. Dlatego w 1945 roku pozycja gospodarcza Włoch i Polski były bardzo podobne. I Włochy w tym czasie powojennym właściwie stały się potęgą przemysłową i ogromne zmiany społeczne, które jeszcze trwają, również w Polsce mogły się zmienić. Oczywiście mieliśmy rękę Stalina, który to temu zapobiegł, więc dlatego też zwracam uwagę, że w Polsce bardzo często minimalizuje się wpływ i zasługi Włoch, nie tylko dla swojego kraju, ale również dla Europy, pewnym ogromnym wysiłkiem i właściwie bez wątpienia pod przewodnictwem chrześcijańskiej demokracji ze wszystkimi błędami, o wszystkim, co pan profesor lekko wspominał w latach następnych. Dziękuję bardzo, przepraszam za długą wypowiedź.
Dziękuję bardzo. Następne pytania, proszę bardzo. Ksiądz rektor.
No, nie rektor. Maciej Hułas, Instytut Socjologii, wykładowca socjologii. Ja mam pytanie do pana profesora Patryka Pasture. Z ogromną przyjemnością słuchałem pańskiego wykładu. Niestety musiałem przed końcem wyjść i przeprowadzić studentów na konferencję. Bardzo też zaintrygował mnie ten temat, który pan profesor poruszył, dlatego że on dotyczy ojczyzny i chrześcijaństwa w Unii Europejskiej. Generalnie pan profesor łączy ideę ojczyzny z czymś, co jak gdyby przybiera nowe oblicze w dzisiejszych warunkach Federacji Europejskiej, jeżeli dobrze zrozumiałem. Moje pytanie jest następujące. Wiadomo, że zmienia się kontekst Europy, wiadomo, że zmienia się charakter państwa narodowego, które nie jest w stanie już kontrolować procesów w obrębie swoich granic, jak to było po I wojnie światowej, kiedy była symetria pomiędzy polityką a ekonomią. I teraz pan profesor stawia to pytanie o ojczyznę. Ja nie wiem, jak mam rozumieć to Fatherland, czy to jest w kategoriach polityki, czy jakichś innych kategoriach. Dla mnie, jako dla duchownego, ojczyzna jest pewną wartością, wartością przede wszystkim etyczną. To słowo patria, która nawiązuje do bardzo osobistych patrius, pater kategorii. I teraz pytanie jest takie, gdzie pan profesor widzi kierunek poszukiwania nowej definicji patrii w warunkach Federacji Europejskiej? Jaki zbiór wartości będzie najbliższy mentalnie tej idei patrii, która będzie miała charakter uniwersalny, bo połączy stare narodowości. Unia Europejska jest szachownicą starych narodów. I to jest moje pytanie. Dziękuję.
Dziękuję bardzo. Proszę bardzo, pan profesor.
wonderful talks, both. I wanted actually to follow up on the question a moment ago to Patrick Pasture, because maybe we can talk about this a little more after the session, but I wanted just to sort of risk a hypothesis or a reinterpretation of your talk and ask if you think that it makes sense, which is that what I take from your discussion of the absence of what you call the palingenetic rebirth after World War II of Europe as Christendom. And I think this works very well with the question a moment ago. I take that, among other things, as your hypothesis that in some sense you can explain the future trajectory and the progressive sort of de-ideologization and declining role of religion as idea within the practices, for example, of Christian democracy. Is that a corollary? Is that a proper corollary to the claim that you're making? Because I think it's interesting to consider in the context also of both of the other talks. It makes for a very interesting conversation point just in terms of how we think of periodization for the transformation of Christian democracy, not just as a set of party political choices and political choices more generally, but as a set of practices and ideas. In some sense in conversation with what Wolfram was saying in his opening remarks about integrating Christian democracy with a new history of ideas. And the second question I have for you is just if you can flesh out a little bit more the two ideas that you mentioned at the very end of your talk, when you said that Christian democracy reimagined the relationship between the religious and the secular. If you can flesh out, please, a little bit, because, I mean, obviously we all have an intuitive notion of what you mean by secular, but if we're reimagining the idea of religion in politics, then I can't just take at face value the word religious. So if I could just push you on both of those. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Next question, Professor Kaiser.
Okay, I have a question for both of you on the panel. First of all, Patrick, you said, you know, what difference does 1945 make in terms of political Catholicism and Christian democracy? My suggestion would be, and I wonder what your thoughts are on this, that the big difference is that the Catholic right that was associated either, as in the French case, with nationalism, or even in the case of individuals like Rohan, of course, with fascist turn, is completely discredited after 1945. At the same time, we actually see the opposite of some of the rhetoric about, you know, creating new welfare state and using this opportunity for changing, transforming societies. We see a marginalization of left Catholicism, also in international relations of Christian democracy, and therefore what we have is a dominance of the sort of centrist, liberal, conservative liberal, or whatever you want to call it, political, or parts of the Christian democracy represented by personalities like the Gasperi and Adenauer and the coalitions in Italy and in Germany with liberal parties, and this is to a lesser extent the case in the Benelux countries or in France, but their preferences for economic integration as a starting point for European integration is very easily compatible with American preferences. And I think this merging of these different perspectives and preferences in the period after 1945-49, I think is very important, but I wonder what your views are on this. And for Antonio Varsori, I'm sometimes wondering, and I agree of course entirely with the fact that it's necessary to integrate fully the Italian contributions to European integration and post-war European developments, but I sometimes wonder whether, for a particular reason that I'll give you in a minute, whether the Italian Christian democratic commitment to European integration hasn't sometimes been far greater at the discursive or rhetorical level than the level of actual politics. Because what I think is special about Italy is that the Christian Democrats are a very highly internally fragmented political party, and this requires an enormous amount of investment of resources in terms of time and energy on the part of politicians to keeping this party together. Plus, they are always heading coalition governments, which are also very highly volatile. I agree that there is this broader stability that the Christian Democrats are always in power, but there is a need to invest a lot of time and energy into domestic politics within the party and in the coalitions in Italy, and relatively limited space remaining for really investing much into European integration, except in these crisis moments like 1965, which you mentioned.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time for discussion is over. So the answers and comments of the presenters, of the lecturers. So first 3 minutes, I'm afraid, only for Professor Pasture. Sure.
Thank you for very, very interesting questions, challenging questions. So it will be very difficult to limit myself 2-3 minutes for each question, let alone for the three. I will say a few things on each of them. The first question on that idea of fatherland, in some ways is the most difficult to answer because I didn't develop that idea too much in this presentation, but first of all, I would say that the idea of fatherland for Christian Democrats and Catholics in a long-term historical perspective is always a little bit difficult because Catholics have a universal affiliation of association as well. But at the same time, you do see all the way of the 19th and 20th century within Catholic thinking, and especially within Catholic practice, which is not exactly the same, the desire to associate with nations, with the nation, not necessarily say the nation state, but with a nation, be it the nation state or a region. As a Flemish, I'm very well placed to see that association of Catholicism with Flanders, for example, with the Flemish movement. That's always been very important. There is also talk in the circles that I discuss about the European fatherland, about Europe as a fatherland. It's not restricted to Christians, but it's certainly a discourse that you do find with people as one, you do find it with some people that are associated with Abraham. The idea of affiliation, of a sense of affiliation with the region and with Europe, with the nation and the European identification, both are not exclusive. That's also a very important element. Even nationalism, in a historical perspective, is absolutely not incompatible with European integration. The great founders of nationalism in the 19th century were also in favor of a European federation, even if they would not necessarily associate Europe with some kind of fatherland. But they referred, for example, to the idea of the United States. Now, in the 1830s, 1840s, the United States were not a nation. They were certainly not a nation state. They are now. And the very fact that the United States evolved into a nation state illustrates that it is, at least theoretically, possible. I think also for the European Union, theoretically. I don't see it happen in a short time, but it's the arguments that are usually invoked against it, for example, the multitude of languages and cultures and so forth, in my opinion, makes no sense. Makes no sense because in the American context, people who come to America also speak very different languages and so forth. They become Americans for a number of reasons. So it's possible also in the long run for Europe. I think it will not happen the same way. We are living in a completely different ways in which, but in some ways it makes it more easy. But I'm a historian. I always say historians are very bad prophets. Cannot predict the future. I always also add that we are not necessarily worse than others, but I don't know. I don't see a European idea of a European nation develop in the near future. I don't see that, but who knows? Yeah, well, your question.
satisfied with what you said. Yeah, because
Use the microphone, please.
Because it's virtually impossible to create some kind of nation, all-encompassing nation in Europe, which would be to everyone's expectation, right? Because it's impossible, because America is a voluntaristic nation. Yeah, whereas
I do think you can have, in the longer term, kind of overlaying identifications which actually are happening already. It's very clear. If I look at my students, for example, in European studies, they have very strong, many have very strong national feelings, but also very strong European. And it's very clear they do associate themselves with Europe. Of course, it's a very particular kind of students who comes to Leuven, study European studies, and I guess it's the same here. It's students who are pro-European. You very rarely have students following European studies who are very skeptical. To some extent, yes, but mostly not. But they prove in daily practice, in reality, that it is possible to have these kind of multiple identities. In fact, it amounts to that. I can imagine that this kind of common feelings will increase. It will mainly increase if there are strong perceived external threats, I think. Otherwise it won't.
Okay, but other questions, because you can continue the very interesting discussion during the coffee breaks, but you know, I'm responsible for time here.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Saying something more about that palingenetic myth. It's clear that that is a major difference. I would first of all say that within Christian democracy, it is part of the essence of Christian democracy, is to a certain extent the acceptance of the secular, of the plurality. Perhaps it's especially that. And there is something I didn't tell in my presentation, I forgot it in part. The recognition of plurality is certainly something new for these Christian Democrats. And that makes a distinction with those people of the Abendland movement and so forth who believe in some kind of Christendom. This being said, it's relevant that I emphasize that also in these movements you have collaboration with people of other orientation, other worldviews. The very fact that these discussions are at international level are significant, because I think one of the most important elements in the global discussion about secularization, I'm not in favor of the so-called secularization thesis, but you do see a secularization of international politics. That is already very old. That this is nothing new, not even in the 19th century. It's something that dates back to the 17th century. It's the secularization of international politics, although coupled with the confessionalization of national politics. In the early modern period, here we do see that the international perspective, to some extent, helps to deconfessionalize national politics, perhaps. That's an idea I have now, because you have your very interesting question. But perhaps we can discuss a little bit more about that later.
During the break, maybe.
I understand. Perhaps I go to your question quickly. I have a few other things.
So, you don't mind?
Yeah.
A few last words, okay?
Yeah.
So excuse me for, okay?
No.
Pushing you too hard, but no.
Yes, you have absolutely right. That is what 1945 implies, is the fact that Catholic right is discredited, the association with fascism. But you point also at the marginalization of left Catholicism. Is clearly also right. don't say very much how I can disagree with that, because that is obviously the case, and that is, I think, partly also what I said. This being said, there is an important difference, but if you go to look at what is very concretely proposed, then you see many continuities with the pre-war period in the social economic field, for example. Yes, there are very interesting elements of a transfer of ideas with the United States. Partly, this transfer happened already before the war, in the 1930s mainly. I think I'm a little bit more familiar with the social economic field. The International Labour Organization played a major role there, and we see a number of Christian labor people, for example, Christian business leaders who went to the United States, studied there, returned, and some of these ideas return after the war. I think that's exactly what you want, the approach that you favor, and that you really can see. And that again makes this whole idea of continuity and discontinuity. You cannot speak in the abstract, the Second World War is a break or not. There are elements of discontinuity and continuity at the same time, and even that is far too simple, because you have continuities at different levels and different chronologies, different temporal dynamics. I refer to here continuities with the early 1930s and the early 1950s, which are divergent from what happened in the later.
Okay, thank you very much. If I may add at this point something, I think also the war is important, because many politicians spend the war in London, having a lot of time for discussion about the future of Europe. So maybe also for the continuity thing, also the moment of war, and especially the moment when the politicians were in London. Some politicians from Europe, from the Netherlands, from Belgium, from Norway, and from Poland, maybe in Czechoslovakia. It was also an important moment when the politicians of this Christian democratic approach to the reality can meet and well spend time in. Okay, but this is something I shouldn't add maybe. Okay, so it's time for Professor Varsori and in his remarks and comments to the questions.
Well, first of all, thank you for the first remark. I completely agree, and we came back, to the traditional link between Poland and Italy, since the Risorgimento onwards, But I think that, especially during the Cold War period, there are now new researchers which are going to demonstrate that there was a sort of Italian Ostpolitik, very cautious, but it was there, And in the context of this Italian Ostpolitik, there were three main actors. The first was the Soviet Union, because it was obvious, the Soviet Union is the big boss, The second was Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was very important in Italian foreign policy. And one of the main goals of Italy's foreign policy as far as Yugoslavia was concerned, Yugoslavia must maintain the role of non-aligned country, And the third was Poland, for tradition, the links of Catholicism and so on and so on. And if you think about the late 1980s, when there was the early, signs of collapse of the Eastern Bloc, we must, for example, remember the initiative by the Italian government. It was the Andreotti government. It was an initiative mainly by Gianni De Michelis, who was foreign minister, a socialist. It was the Adriatic Initiative, the so-called Iniziativa Adriatica, and then the so-called Quadrangolare, a way to strengthen economic, cultural, social relationship between Austria, Yugoslavia, Italy, and Hungary, and later on with Poland and Czechoslovakia. That it was a tradition, in Italian foreign policy since the 19th century. The Dragna hosting, of Italy's foreign policy. The second aspect, as far as Wolfram said, well, I agree, of course, there was a lot of time-consuming in domestic policy issues and so on. But we must not forget two things when we examine Italy's European policy. The first, if we think in general about Italy's foreign policy, there was a real continuity. If we think about the period between the late 1950s till the the early 1990s, the peoples who were really in charge of Italy's foreign policy were no more than 5 or 6, which meant Fanfani, Moro, Colombo, sometimes Rumor, and Andreotti. And they stayed there, on several occasions in different governments, but they maintained also a close relationship with the Italian diplomatic corps, which was important, So there was a continuity in the presence of these Christian Democrat leaders who were committed to foreign policy and also the Italian diplomacy. And when we think about Italian European policy, I think we must go beyond the rhetorical declaration and statements, which sometimes are boring, with no real content, I completely agree, just words. But behind that, there was a pragmatic, realistic European policy, which was the result of the activities of very small European elite, which was formed by some politicians who really understood what the European community meant for Italy, especially for the Italian economy. If the Italian economy was in good shape, it was a lot of money. It was in bad shape, there was the external bound. So the European bound, which could help the Italian governments to solve their own internal economic problems. So there was very clear. And also the other problem is that the Christian democracy for a long period was the party of the state, which meant that there was a sort of overlapping between the state structures and the Christian democracy, especially the two big technocracies, which were interested in the European policy. At first, during the 1950s, the IRI, and especially after the 1970s, since the 1970s, the Bank of Italy. People like Ciampi, Dini, Baffi, and well, they were Europeanists, and they were, of course, closely connected with the Christian democracy political leadership. Think of the last example. The person who really did the negotiation during the Maastricht Treaty. I'm not speaking about the political aspect. In this case was Andreotti and the Michelis. But the European Monetary Union, the Economic and Monetary Union, which was by far more important, because it's the point of reference for Italian economy since 1992. The point of reference is also, the problem of the Italian economy during the last 20 years. The main of the Italian, the main actor in the Italian negotiation team was Guido Carli, which was treasury minister, a technocrat, but at the same time he was elected in the Christian democracy. And we must not forget that a young chap in that period, which was the Director General of the Italian Ministry of Treasury, was Mario Draghi, who is now obviously, the president of the European Bank. So we must not forget, that it was a very pragmatic policy, and the fact that it was run by very few people who had close connections.
Dziękuję bardzo. Dziękuję. Thank you very much to all the members of my panel.